Welcome to this trip to Vermont, which is home to one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and what time you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. That year, the fall of 1951 in Wallier seemed especially bad. The leaves of the maple trees had fallen off earlier than usual, leaving the countryside bare and exposed under gray November skies. People stayed inside more during this season, and conversations were quieter and looks were more careful. But for people who lived near the old colonial estate at 1847 Elmidge Road, the quiet had a meaning that had nothing to do with the weather. Cordelia Hargreeve, a 47-year-old widow, owned the property. She got the big 3-story Georgian manor from her late husband, Lysander Hargreeve, after he died of a stroke in 1949. The house was on a 40-acre plot of land at the end of a long, winding dirt road, about 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and 7 miles from the center of Melio. The Washington County Clerk's Office's local records say that Captain Jeremiah Whitmore, a Continental Army officer who got the land as payment for his service, built the structure in 1789. The estate's architecture was typical of federal period buildings, which were simple but elegant. Red brick front with white wood trim and windows that are perfectly symmetrical. There are rows of windows on 3 floors and a unique widow's walk on the roof. The Hargreeve house was different from other colonial estates in the area because of the way its basement was set up. The original building plans filed with the county in 1790 show that the cellar went far beyond the house's foundation. They included what looked like natural limestone caves that had been found during construction. Captain Whitmore's original letters are still in the Vermont. The Historical Society's archives show that local indigenous people had known about the cave system for generations before Europeans settled there. Whitmore wrote to his brother on March 15, 1789, that the local Abnaki had warned him not to build over the caves because they were used by spirits for reasons he thought were too superstitious to write about in detail. But he decided to include the caves in his plans because they were useful for storing things and keeping the temperature stable. Plans for the foundation. People in Montpelier knew Cordelia Hargreeve as a woman with good taste and a lot of reserve. Her name was Cordelia Ashworth, and she was born in Boston to a family that worked in the textile business. She met Lysander when he was a bank manager in Massachusetts. People thought their marriage in 1925 was a good thing because Lysander was very rich and well known in Vermont's business community. In 1928, the couple moved to the Elm Ridge property, where, for more than 20 years, they lived a quiet, somewhat lonely life. People who knew Cordelia said she was smart but cold, polite but never warm. From 1935 to 1963, Margaret Thornfield was the postmistress in Montpelier. She remembered that Cordelia came to town twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Fridays, and always wore the same black wool coat, no matter what the weather was like. She always spoke in measured, careful sentences that didn't give away what she was thinking. Her shopping habits were very steady. Every week, she bought the same things in the same amounts, as if she were following a strict schedule that never changed. From the outside, the couple's relationship seemed friendly, but observant neighbors sometimes noticed a kind of formality between them that seemed strange, even for people of their age and social class. Reverend Isaiah Blackthorne of the First Congregational Church, where the Hargreaves went to church often, talked about the Hargreaves in private. In the 12 years that he had been a pastor to the family, he had never seen real love between the husband and wife. He would have preferred a cold courtesy to open hostility, which made him feel more uneasy. Reverend Blackthorne's journals, which were given to the church archives after he died in 1956, give us more information about how the Hargreeve family worked. On September 12, 1947, he wrote, "During my visit to the Hargreeve estate today, I saw something that made me think. I found their home life troubling. Cordelia served tea with her usual skill, but I noticed that she set the table for 4 people, even though only Lysander and I were there for the visit. When I pointed this out, she looked confused for a moment, then quickly took away the extra settings and said she had expected other guests who didn't show up. However, Lysander's reaction made it clear that this wasn't the first time she had forgotten something, after Lysander's sudden death in." In March 1949, Cordelia became even more isolated. She let go of all the household staff except for Bartholomew Creed, an old groundskeeper who had worked for the family since 1940. She then started doing all of her business through written correspondence. She only went into town once a month for the most important errands, and Bartholomew Creed gave the most detailed account of life at the Hargreeve estate right after Lysander's death. In December 1951, he told the Washington County Sheriff's Department that Cordelia had changed a lot after she became a widow. Before, she had strict schedules and made sure the house and grounds were well kept. Now, she spent whole days in what Creed called a suspended state, sitting for hours in the library without reading or standing at the big front windows as if she was waiting for something that never came. Creed also said that Cordelia had developed strange habits around the house. She had told him he couldn't go into the basement for any reason. Even when pipes froze during the harsh winter of 1949 to 1950, and he suggested hiring a plumber to fix the problem, she told him to just turn off the water to that part of the house. She had also started locking certain rooms on the second floor, like what had been Lysander's study and the old guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Most strangely, Creed noticed that Cordelia had started to, leaving food outside the locked basement door each evening. When questioned about this practice, she explained that they had mice, though Creed noted that he had never seen evidence of rodent infestation in his 11 years maintaining the property. The food, he noticed, always disappeared by morning, though he never observed any creature taking it. Moreover, the quantities seemed far too large for mice. Full plates of prepared meals complete with silverware and cloth napkins arranged as if for formal. The first sign that something was very wrong at the Hargreeve estate came on November 14, 1951. Bartholomew Creed arrived at his usual time of 7:30 a.m. to find the front door wide open, even though the temperature had dropped to nearly 20 degrees overnight. The house was cold and quiet, and Cordelia was nowhere to be found. Creed's account of that morning, which is kept in the Sheriff's Department files, gives a detailed description of what he saw. The house. At first glance, everything seemed normal. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Cordelia's things were still where they always were. Her jewelry, including several valuable pieces that Lysander's mother had given her, was still in the bedroom drawer. Her winter coat was still hanging in the front closet. Her purse, which held almost $300 in cash, was still on the kitchen table where she usually left it. However, some things bothered Creed right away. The food he had seen Cordelia put outside the basement door. The door, which had been securely locked for over 2 years, was now slightly ajar. A draft of air came through the opening, bringing with it what Creed called an unpleasant sweet smell, like flowers left too long in water, mixed with something earthy and old. More concerning was the state of Cordelia's bedroom. While her clothes were still neatly arranged in the wardrobe, her bed showed no signs of having been slept in. The coverlet lay smooth and undisturbed, and the pillows properly positioned. Creed found a cup of tea that was still warm on the nightstand, and an open book that only had a picture of a dark hallway on one page and no text on the other. Creed had never seen the book before, even though he had been in charge of the household library for years, and it was bound in a strange dark leather that felt strangely warm to the touch. Most disturbing of all, Creed found a note written in Cordelia's handwriting on the kitchen table. The note that was later used as evidence said, "I have gone to fulfill the arrangement Lander made. Don't look for me in the places you know. Thank you for your loyal work. The right people will take care of the house. Hearts." The note was dated November 13th, 1951, but the ink was a strange dark red color that Creed couldn't place. Creed looked around the house and called Cordelia's name for about an hour before deciding to call the police. Sheriff Ezekiel. Mohouse, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had handled every major crime in Washington County since 1925, arrived at the property around 10 o'clock that morning, accompanied by Deputy Harold Finch. According to Sheriff Morius's official report, the first investigation was normal, but strange. The clear reasons for Cordelia's absence didn't match up with the evidence. If she left on her own, why would she leave her coat behind in November? Why not take her money with her? If someone did something wrong, where were the signs of a fight? Why hadn't anyone taken her things? The note, saying that someone else would take care of the house when no one else lived there, was the most confusing part. The investigation team carefully searched the house, starting with the main living areas and working their way through each room in a set order. They didn't see anything strange until they got to the basement. The door that Creed had said was ajar now looked like it was securely closed. The sheriff and his deputy both said they hadn't seen anyone come near it. Even more strange, the door now had a new lock that none of the investigators had seen earlier in the day. When they tried to open the basement door, they found that it was locked from the inside with a complicated mechanism that Sheriff Mohouse had never seen before in his 30 years of working in law enforcement. They yelled out over and over again, but no one answered. The report from the sheriff says that while they were standing outside the door, they could hear what sounded like faint movement from below, along with what might have been whispered conversation. It was hard to tell if the sounds were coming from people or maybe settling wood in the old house. Deputy Finch was told to look at the outside basement entrance, which was a pair of wooden doors that opened up from the garden. He found these doors locked and chained with what looked like a very old lock that had a lot of rust on it. Rust. The chain had clearly been there for years, maybe even decades, because rust had stuck it to the metal hinges. But Finch noticed something strange. The lock and chain looked old, but the new scratches around the keyhole showed that it had been used recently. Sheriff Mohouse couldn't get into the basement right away, so he decided to put off that part of the search until he could go back with the right tools. He told Deputy Finch to stay at the property while he drove back to town to get a locksmith and some other tools. The sheriff's short absence turned out to be important for reasons that would only become clear later. Deputy Finch, who was in charge of watching the house while Morehouse was gone for 2 hours, said he heard a number of different sounds. Around 12:30 p.m., he heard what sounded like someone walking slowly across the floor above him. He was on the ground floor and could see that the second floor was empty. The footsteps followed a pattern that was always the same, if someone were walking back and forth in the same room for a few minutes. At 1:15 p.m., he heard piano music coming from the parlor, even though he had checked the parlor himself and found that it did not have a piano. It was easy to tell what the music was, a sad song that sounded like a funeral hymn. It was played very well, but it was somehow muffled, as if the sound were coming through walls or floors to reach him. When he looked into the parlor again, he found it just as empty as before, but the air was different. The room felt much cooler than the rest of the house. At 2 p.m., Deputy Finch heard Cordelia's voice calling his name from somewhere in the house. This was the most disturbing thing of all. It sounded like the voice was coming from more than one place at once, like she was moving through different rooms at the same time while calling to him. He called her back and looked for her, but the house was still empty. 3 days after the event, Finch filed a second report in which he said that the voice had sounded exactly like Cordelia's, but the way it sounded made him think that she wasn't upset or in a hurry. Instead, it sounded like she was inviting him to join her for tea. At 2:45 p.m., the most disturbing thing happened. Just before Sheriff Morius got back. From outside the house, Deputy Finch saw movement in the basement windows. The basement windows, which had been dark all morning, now showed light that flickered like candles or oil lamps. More importantly, he could see shadows, moving across the lit windows in ways that made it look like several people were doing something organized. Finch walked up to the basement windows to get a better look, and found that even though they were partially below ground level, they still gave a clear view of the basement space. His detailed report said that he saw a fully furnished living room with rugs, furniture, and what looked like a formal dining table set for a group of people. Many. People dressed in clothes that looked like they were from an earlier time were moving around the room as if they were doing normal household chores. Finch's most important finding was that she could positively identify one of the figures as Cordelia Hargreeve. Finch recognized the dark blue dress she was wearing as one she had worn to church services. She seemed to be in charge of setting up the dining table. She moved in a natural and purposeful way, showing no signs of being upset or forced. At one point, she turned her head. She smiled warmly and waved her hand in greeting as she looked directly at the window where Finch was watching. Then she went back to what she was doing. At 3:30 p.m., Sheriff Mohouse came back with Silas Weatherby, a barra locksmith who was an expert in old locks. Weatherby looked at the lock on the basement door and said it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The lock looked like it had been hand-forged and could have been made during the colonial period. It was held shut by a mechanism that worked from both sides of the door. Even more strange, the key that would have opened the lock from the outside seemed to have been broken off on purpose, leaving only a piece of metal stuck in place to keep it from working. Sheriff Mohouse immediately went to check Deputy Finch's report of what he saw from the basement windows. But now the basement windows were completely dark, and no one could see any movement from outside. In his report, the sheriff said that the windows looked to have been covered from the inside with some kind of dark cloth or boarding that made it impossible to see inside the basement. Weatherby was able to force the lock in the end, but he warned that the door might get damaged in the process. The job took almost an hour because the mechanism was much more complicated than it looked on the outside. When the basement door finally opened, it showed a narrow stone staircase that went down into the dark. The sweet but bad smell that. Creed's earlier words came back to life more strongly, making both the sheriff and deputy step back for a moment. Sheriff Mohouse went down the stairs first, using an electric lantern that the fire department had lent him. What he found in the basement of Hargreeve would be the subject of investigation, speculation, and debate for decades to come. The basement was much bigger than the house's footprint would have led you to believe. It went into natural limestone caves that had been built into the house, the way it was built in the first place. The worked stone that made up the house's foundation slowly gave way to rough cave walls that the lantern's beam couldn't reach. The main area had flagstone floors, but the parts where the basement went into the caves had packed earth floors that were clearly worn down by foot traffic. The contents of the basement were more important than its size. It was clear that the space had been set up as a living area, with furniture, rugs, and what looked like places to sleep. But everything was covered in decades of dust and decay, which made it look like no one had lived there in a long time. Ropes stretched between support beams held up torn curtains that made the larger space look like it had separate rooms. There were bits of what might have been books on a table, but moisture and time had turned them into unreadable pulp. Even though it looked like it had been left behind, some areas were clearly showing signs of. Recent events. Sheriff Mohouse found proof of current habitation in the farthest corner of the basement, where the stone floor met the natural cave floor. They had made a sleeping area out of blankets and pillows that looked much newer than the other furniture. There were a few things next to this makeshift bed that made it look like someone had been living in the basement. A leather-bound journal, reading glasses, a hand mirror, and a few pieces of clothing. What Sheriff Mohouse found near the journal was the most disturbing. A formal setting. A small table was set up with fine china, silverware, and cloth napkins. The plate had the remains of what looked like a meal that had just been eaten, and the wine glass had some red liquid in it. An oil lamp nearby was still burning with a steady flame, which made the cave walls look like they were moving. The journal, which became an important piece of evidence in the case, had entries that went back to shortly after Lysander's death in 1949. The first few entries were just boring, everyday things about daily life and taking care of the house. But starting in late 1949, the tone and content of the entries changed a lot. On December 23, 1949, someone wrote, "The sounds from below have become more frequent and clearer. I can no longer convince myself they are just settling timbers or small animals. Last night, I heard what sounded like conversation, but I couldn't make out the words. This morning, I found the basement door unlocked, even though I remember locking it before." Lysander never said anything about people living under our house, but the evidence shows that he knew they were there. In an entry from January 15, 1950, he wrote, "I have found out the truth about the locked rooms. Lysander didn't lock them up to keep memories safe, as he told me. He locked them to keep something inside. I found his private papers yesterday, behind a fake panel in his desk. There was always something in the basement during our marriage. We were never alone in this house. There are papers that go back to the original building that explains the agreements made with the people who lived in the cave. It seems that Captain Whitmore made some kind of deal with them when he built the house. The journal entries go on into 1950 and 1951, showing how Cordelia became more aware of what she called the others living under the house. She said that the basement caves went much deeper than anyone had thought, and were connected to a network of natural tunnels that had been used for reasons she was only starting to figure out. A very disturbing entry from March 17, 1951, says, "They have been waiting for me to join them. Lysander promised them I would, but he never told me about this plan. I understand now why he would never let me go with him on his evening walks. He wasn't walking in the garden, he was visiting them below. I know this because they have shown me the way. They are not what you would expect from people who live in caves. They are educated, cultured, and have knowledge that goes back hundreds of years. They have their own society and customs that are completely separate from the world above." An entry from June 8, 1951, gives more information about these underground people. "I have learned their history from talking to them through the door. They are descendants of colonial settlers who went underground during wars and persecutions. Some of them can trace their lineage back to religious groups that wanted to be alone from the rest of society. Some of them are the last members of families who went missing during wars or economic crises. They have built a stable community that has lasted for generations, thanks to careful planning and occasional interactions with chosen surface dwellers. The journal shows that these interactions were made official through agreements with certain property owners. Cordelia's account says that Captain Whitmore was the first to set up such an arrangement, allowing the cave dwellers to continue living in exchange for their services. For certain reasons. Each new owner of the property had been slowly brought into the arrangement and eventually asked to take a bigger role in the underground community. A July 20th, 1951 entry explains Lysander's role. I now understand why Lysander was so careful to keep the property exactly as it was when we got it. He was following through on promises made by previous owners. The evening meals I thought he ate alone in the basement were actually. We had communal dinners with our neighbors below. The supplies he said were for storage were actually food for their community. In return, they gave him advice and information that helped him in his business. The deal was good for both sides and had been going on for over 100 years. The last entries in the journal are from November 13, 1951, and they are about Cordelia's plans for what she called joining the community properly. She wrote, "Tonight, I will fulfill the promise he made on my 4. It's not about forcing someone to do something or being desperate. It's about joining a society that values learning, stability, and helping each other more than the unknowns of the outside world. They have been patient while I finished grieving and took care of my business above ground. I'm ready to join them now." Sheriff Mose's search of the basement turned up a number of other disturbing facts. Along with proof that Cordelia had been there recently, he also found signs that the space had been lived in for a long time. Some of the preserved food in storage areas looked like it had just been eaten. The kitchen area was rough and had tools and containers that looked like they had been used recently. The most confusing thing of all was that one part of the caves had what looked like sleeping areas for several people, along with personal items that hinted at different times when people lived there. The sheriff's report says that there were a number of passages that went from the main basement area deeper into the cave system. These tunnels were narrow, but they were well kept, with carved niches along the walls that held oil lamps. The tunnels seemed to go a long way underground and led to rooms that served different purposes, such as storage, workshops, and what looked like places for people to gather. But Deputy Finch's search of a tunnel about 50 yards from the main basement showed them something that made them rethink what they thought they knew about what they were up against. The tunnel opened up into a big, natural room that had been turned into what could only be called an underground town square. There were carved stone benches all around a central area where several paths came together. Oil lamps placed in wall niches gave off steady light. The chamber showed clear signs of recent use, which was the most important thing. There are warm ashes in the middle of the fire pit. Items belonging to people were spread out on the benches and food prep areas, which made it seem like the community got together often. Deputy Finch also found that some parts of the cave system had been changed with a lot of engineering skill. A complex drainage system moved groundwater away from places where people lived. Some of the ventilation shafts looked natural, while others were made bigger on purpose. They let fresh air flow through the whole underground complex. They carved storage rooms out of solid rock and put in wooden shelves that held everything from preserved foods to manufactured goods. That looked like it had just been bought from surface suppliers. Finch's discovery of what looked like a library chamber was the most disturbing. There were hundreds of books on stone shelves. Some of them looked old, while others looked new. There was a reading area with comfortable furniture and enough light for long periods of study. There were a few books open on reading tables, which made it seem like they had just been looked at. The visible books talked about a wide range of things, from religious and historical texts to modern books about farming, medicine, and technology. The investigation was made more difficult by the fact that the cave system had a lot of signs of habitation, but the investigators didn't find any actual inhabitants while they were looking. The chambers looked like they had just been left behind, as if the people who lived there had moved deeper into the cave system or temporarily moved while the investigation was going on. The search team did find clear proof, though, that they were being watched while they were working. They would move or rearrange their personal things when they went to different chambers. They would find fresh food in places where they had previously seen nothing. The most disturbing thing was that they sometimes found notes addressed to them by name, written in beautiful handwriting on old paper. thanking them for being polite and not causing too much trouble in the community while they were doing their investigation. After 5 days, the official investigation came to an end without finding out what happened to Cordelia or finding any real people who lived there. The Cave Network. Sheriff Mohouse filed a missing persons report for Cordelia and said the case should stay open, but no new leads came up. The court ordered that the house be locked up until the estate issues were settled because Cordelia had not left a will and no known living relatives could be found. Investigators didn't pay much attention to Bartholomew Creed's other testimony, which was included in the case files. Creed says that the night before Cordelia went missing, he had stayed at the property later than usual to put away outdoor tools before a storm that was expected. Around 9 o'clock, while he was working near the tool shed, he saw light coming from the basement windows. This was strange because he had never seen those windows open before. More importantly, Creed said he saw shadows moving across those lit windows in ways that made it look like there were several people at a formal dinner party. As he got closer to the house, when he looked into it, he heard what sounded like people talking and laughing, as if a group of people were having a nice meal together. He couldn't make out individual words because the conversation was too quiet, but the tone was clearly friendly and relaxed. But when Creed looked toward the front of the house, he saw Cordelia sitting alone in the library window, as if she were reading. This made things impossible. How could she be alone in the library and also at the gathering in the basement? Creed watched for a few minutes, switching between looking out the basement windows and the library. He confirmed that Cordelia was still in the library while the basement activity was going on. Creed's statement ends with him saying that he heard music coming from the basement that night. It sounded like a small group of people playing sad but not unpleasant songs. The music went on until about 11 o'clock, and then the basement windows came back to darkness, and the house became quiet like it always does at night. The investigation officially ended in March 1952, and Cordelia Hargreeve was listed as a missing person under circumstances that could not be determined. The estate was finally sold in August 1953 to the Montpelier Commercial Development Company, which planned to divide the land into smaller lots for building homes. But the development project ran into problems that weren't expected. The pole, the team that was hired to map the property, found that the underground cave system was much larger than what had been found before. The limestone caves made a huge network under not just the Hargreeve property, but also a lot of the area around it. More of a problem for development. Some of these tunnels had signs of structural changes that could make any construction in the area less safe. Dr. Araminta Thorne's geological survey of the geology department at the University of Vermont found more disturbing information about the cave system. In her report to the state in September 1953, she said that the caves showed clear signs of having been changed by people for at least 200 years. Carved passages linked natural chambers, and some parts looked like they had been dug out on purpose to make bigger spaces for community events. Dr. Thorne's team also found what looked like a complicated system of roads and buildings. System made to help people live underground for a long time. This engineering made it seem like someone had put a lot of time and work into making parts of the cave system completely self-sufficient for long periods of time. The most puzzling thing about her survey was that it found several hidden entrances to the cave system spread out over several square miles. Most of these entrances were hidden by natural growth or were purposely camouflaged. After getting Dr. Thorne's report, the development company gave up on their subdivision project because it would be too expensive to fix the geological problems. Later, the Hargreeve property was sold again, this time to a private buyer named Percal Ashford. He bought it in 1954 as a summer home. Ashford, a retired literature professor from Dartmouth College, didn't know anything about the property's history when he bought it. He told a journalist who was looking into the case years later that he liked the colonial style of the house and the fact that it was private, its remote location. He wanted to use the estate for writing and doing research for school after he retired. Ashford lived peacefully on the property for almost 3 years before anything strange happened. In the spring of 1957, he started looking into the basement storage areas to get ready for putting in a new heating system. Ashford didn't have any ideas about what he might find in the basement before he went there, unlike the other investigators. What he found out was that since the investigation in 1951, the basement had been cleaned and reorganized. All signs of previous habitation had been carefully removed. Sheriff Mouse's report said that the temporary rooms, sleeping areas, and storage spaces were all gone. It looked like a normal colonial-era basement with natural cave extensions, which is what you'd expect to find under an 18th-century house built in a limestone area. But Ashford soon started to notice other strange things. It looked like his food supplies were running out faster than he was eating them. He sometimes heard noises coming from the basement level at night, but when he looked into it, he found nothing strange. Most importantly, he found that things in the house would sometimes be moved or changed in small ways that he thought were due to his own forgetfulness. Things got worse during the winter of 1957 to 1958. Ashford started to find proof that someone was getting into his house. Often, but he could never figure out how this was happening. In the morning, doors he had locked would be open. People would open windows that had been closed. Someone would make food in the kitchen and leave it there as if they expected him to find it and eat it. Instead of calling the police right away, Ashford chose to keep track of these events in a systematic way. As a scholar, he was interested in what looked like a complicated mystery, and he hoped that careful observation might give a reason that makes sense. He started keeping detailed records of strange events, including the times, places, and specific details of each one. Ashford's logs, which he later gave to the Vermont Historical Society, show that he was interacting with people more and more throughout 1958. Things went from small problems to more direct communication. By fall, Ashford was getting notes written in beautiful handwriting on old paper that were addressed to him. Most of the time, these notes were polite. Questions about his health, comments on his academic work, and invitations to join social events that weren't specified. The notes showed that the writer knew a lot about Ashford's daily life, his research interests, and his personal tastes. They would praise him for certain books he was reading, give him helpful feedback on his writing projects, and suggest resources that were very helpful for his schoolwork. The tone was always respectful and thought-provoking, but the anonymous authors clearly knew a lot about both Ashford's work and the field he studied. The most important thing that happened in Ashford's records happened on December 15, 1958. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up to the sound of people talking in the basement. In the past, he had heard sounds that were hard to make out. This time, though, he could clearly hear several voices talking about something that sounded like an academic discussion. Ashford sneaked up to the door to the basement and listened closely. He could tell that there were at least 4 different voices, 2 women and 2 men. You could clearly hear their conversation, which was very smart and covered a wide range of topics, from classical literature to modern philosophy. The participants showed a lot of knowledge by quoting from sources in many languages and having complicated theoretical conversations that would have been fine in university seminars. More interestingly, the conversation sometimes brought up Ashford's own work with the participants gave him useful feedback and ideas for his current research projects. They talked about his writing like co-workers who had read it carefully, even though Ashford was sure he had never shared his manuscripts with anyone in the area. One of the female voices was clearly talking about Ashford, saying that he would be a great addition to our community and hoping that he would join them. This was the most disturbing part. For their upcoming evening discussion, as his viewpoint would significantly enhance their intellectual discourse. The voice that said this sounded warm and inviting, not threatening, but the meaning was scary. Ashford spent the rest of the night sitting outside the basement door and listening to people talk until dawn. The participants talked about a lot of different academic subjects, and they showed that they knew a lot about things from many different fields and time periods. At some point, one of the voices spoke directly to him in the early morning hours, acknowledging that he was outside the door and inviting him to join the conversation if he wanted to. When Ashford didn't answer, the voice, which he thought belonged to a well-educated woman, told him that they were patient and would wait until he was ready to join in. She said that their community valued academic discussion above all else, and that they had been looking for someone with his level of intelligence to join their permanent faculty, so to speak. After this, Ashford decided to leave the property. The next day, he called a real estate agent and set up a time to put the house back on the market. However, he kept writing down what he saw during the month it took to close the sale. This gave researchers the most detailed account of the strange things that happened at the Hargreeve estate. In the last few weeks he was at the property, Ashford saw a number of things that he wrote down every detail. He said that the basement door, which he had locked with several locks, was sometimes found open in the morning. He found what looked like seminar materials in his study, with books open to certain pages and papers arranged in ways that made it look like he was getting ready for an academic discussion. There were also notes in the margins of his own work that gave him scholarly commentary from points of view he hadn't thought of before. Most importantly, Ashford said that he started getting written. During the night, invitations were slipped under his bedroom door. These notes, written in the same beautiful handwriting he had seen before, formally asked him to come to the evening colloquium in the basement at 9 o'clock. The notes told him that everyone would be happy to have him there and that he would find the intellectual exchange both interesting and rewarding. The invitations had detailed descriptions of the topics that would be talked about, reading lists to help people get ready, and promises that the community had a large library, resources that he would have access to. The academic topics suggested for discussion were directly related to Ashford's research interests, which suggests that the invitation was meant to pique his scholarly interest. Ashford never accepted these invitations, but he did say in his last log entry that he was becoming more and more tempted to do so. The academic community described in the notes had everything he had hoped to find in retirement: mental stimulation, access to a lot of research materials, and the chance to work with other scholars who seemed to share his love of learning. He would have seriously thought about the opportunity if it weren't for the strange circumstances of their home. The Vermont State Historical Commission bought the property in January 1959, with the goal of preserving it as an example of federal period architecture. But the commission's plans were thrown off when their restoration team ran into the same strange things that had bothered people before. People who lived there. During their short time at the property, the restoration team, led by architect Harrison Whitmore, who is a descendant of the house's original builder, recorded many events. Workers said that tools moved around overnight, supplies disappeared only to show up in strange places, and they always felt like someone was watching them. Reports from team members who worked late shifts were more worrying. Several employees said they heard. People said they heard talking and moving around in the basement at night, and one electrician said he saw a woman who looked like Cordelia Hargreeve standing in the kitchen at dusk. He said that the woman politely told him to be careful with the wiring in the basement because it could bother the people who lived below. Master carpenter Josiah Fletcher wrote the most detailed report. He was working alone in the house one night in May 1959. He told the police that he saw a number of people dressed in colonial-era clothing who were clearly experts at looking at his restoration work. They talked to him in great detail about how buildings were built in the past, showed off their impressive knowledge of the 18th century building methods, and gave him suggestions that were very helpful for keeping the restoration historically accurate. Fletcher said that the people were polite, well-educated, and really wanted to keep the historical integrity of the house. They thanked the workers for their hard work and offered to share what they knew about how the building was originally built. Fletcher asked how they had gotten into the house after hours, and they said they had lived there for much longer than any surface occupants and thought of themselves as the building's permanent caretakers. In June 1959, the State Commission gave up on the restoration project, saying, "Cost overruns and problems with the schedule." The property was quietly sold back to a private owner, this time to someone who wanted to tear down the house and use the land for farming. The demolition project that took place in the fall of 1959 was the last thing that was written down about the Hargreeve case. The demolition crew, who had worked on tearing down buildings from the colonial era, thought the job would take a few days. Instead, they ran into problems that made the process take longer than expected. Weeks, which meant that the project was never finished. The crew's main problem came when they tried to deal with the basement and cave system. The first plan was to fill the underground spaces with concrete to stop settling or structural problems from happening in the future. But when workers started to look into the cave network to figure out how much material they would need, they found that it was much bigger than any previous survey had shown. The caves went in many directions from the base of the house. The demolition foreman said that the complex looked like a small city underground. There were several passages that led to rooms big enough to hold a lot of people. Many of these rooms showed clear signs of careful, long-term planning and development. Carved stone fixtures, advanced drainage systems, and even what looked like crude but effective lighting systems all pointed to the fact that the caves had been turned into a permanent place to live. The personal items that were found were even more disturbing throughout the cave system. The demolition crew found furniture, books, clothes, and other household items spread out over several rooms. Some of these things looked very old, maybe from the colonial period, while others looked much newer. A few things were found that belonged to Cordelia Hargreeve, but it was still unclear how they got to the deep cave chambers. The demolition project had to stop when workers said they wouldn't do it anymore, after what the foreman called direct contact with the people who live there now. Reports sent to the contractor's insurance company say that several crew members said they saw people living in the cave system who came up to them while they were working to voice their worries about the demolition project. Multiple workers have consistently reported that these people were well-dressed, well-spoken, and clearly educated. They said that the cave system was their permanent home and asked that the demolition work should stay away from some parts of the community where the people lived. They said they would buy the property at fair market value if the demolition could be stopped, and they gave detailed maps showing parts of the cave system that could be filled in safely without affecting their homes. The last thing that happened that stopped the demolition project was on October 23, 1959. 3 workers who went into the cave system to put in drainage equipment said they found a fully set dining table in one of them. Of the bigger rooms, with lit candles, food ready to eat, and 6 place settings. When they went back with the foreman to look into it, they found not only the dinner set up, but also several people who politely greeted them and explained that they had made the meal in the hopes of finding a solution to the demolition problem that everyone could agree on. The next day, the demolition company gave up on the project, leaving the main house partly torn down, and the basement and cave system are still there. The property owner had to pay a lot of unexpected costs and couldn't find another contractor willing to finish the work, so they gave the land to the State Forest Service. In 1960, the site became part of Putney State Forest. The rest of the house and the basement entrances were sealed off and marked as dangerous. The official records of the Forest Service say that there are unstable caves underground and tell hikers to stay away from the area. There is no mention of, made in public records about the property's past or the reasons why it was left behind. But in the years that followed, researchers, journalists, and people who were just curious about the site became unofficially interested in it because of stories about the unsolved disappearance and strange events that happened there. Most of these investigations were short and didn't find much new information. This was partly because getting into the sealed basement area required special tools and permission that was rarely given. Dr. Isadora Blackwood, a sociology professor at Midbury College who was studying intentional communities in Vermont, did the most thorough modern investigation in 1967. Dr. Blackwood got permission from the state to do a limited archaeological survey of the cave system. He wanted to find out how much people had changed the caves and maybe learn more about the social structure of the underground community. Dr. Blackwood's team spent 3 weeks making maps of the cave system and keeping track of the things they found. Their findings showed that the caves had been used almost constantly from colonial times until the 1950s, with evidence of several different periods of growth and development. The team found what looked like family homes, communal areas, workshops, and storage spaces, which showed that the society was very organized and complicated. Most importantly, Dr. Blackwood's survey showed that some parts of the cave system were still being used. Modern items like fresh food, clothes, and other things showed that someone had been living in the caves as recently as the mid-1960s. The team also found strong proof that the underground community had set up advanced ways to stay in touch with the surface world. These included carefully hidden entrance points and supply networks that let them get modern goods without being seen. Dr. Blackwood's research was cut short when some of her team members started saying they had direct contact with people who live in the cave system now. Team members said they met people who seemed to be living in the caves and talked to them about their research project. The important event happened on the last planned day of the survey. 2 graduate students working in one of the deeper chambers said they found a room that looked like a comfortable library and meeting space. Several people were there, and they were talking about what looked like an academic seminar, based on there. They said that the people they met were wearing a mix of old and new clothes and spoke in a formal, educated way that made it seem like they had learned a lot. The students said that the people they met were friendly and interested in the research project. They said that their community had lived in the cave system for many generations, running their own schools and social groups, while sometimes interacting with people from the surface world. They were interested in Dr. Blackwood's academic work and asked her to come to their community to talk more about their history and social structure. Dr. Blackwood herself went down to look into what the students said and confirmed what they said happened. In her last report, she talks about meeting with community leaders who showed a lot of knowledge about academic methods and said they would be willing to take part in scholarly research about their society as long as it was done in a way that was respectful of their privacy. Research would not put their privacy or safety at risk. Dr. Blackwood and the community representatives agreed to end the archaeological survey. Dr. Blackwood submitted her initial findings to the state, but did not finalize her planned extensive study. Her research notes at the Vermont Historical Society show that she came to the conclusion that the cave community was a unique type of intentional society that had been able to stay independent for more than 200 years. Dr. Blackwood's last report, which she filed in September 1967, ends with comments that show her professional judgment of what she had found. The community we met under Putney State Forest is a great example of how to organize people and keep their culture alive. They have built a stable, educated society that has survived major changes in history while still holding on to their core values and traditions. Their readiness to collaborate with external researchers, coupled with their evident success in maintaining their chosen way of life, suggests that this community should be recognized as a significant anthropological phenomenon rather than dismissed as an anomaly. The state reacted to Dr. Blackwood's findings by putting permanent limits on who could get into the cave system. The area was given a new classification as a protected geological site, and only state-approved scientific research could enter. Since 1967, no one has been allowed to do this kind of research, but the rules seem to have been more concerned with the privacy of the community than with safety. The official records of the Hargreeve case end with Dr. Blackwood's survey, but unofficial reports and local legends have grown over the years. People who hike in Putney State Forest sometimes say they hear music or talking coming from the ground near the old Hargreeve property. Campers say that they have found prepared food left at their campsites overnight, along with polite notes. Notes that showed hope that the gifts would be helpful during their time in the woods. Residents of Montpelier and nearby towns most often say that they sometimes see people whose clothes, speech, and behavior make them look like they are from an earlier time in history. Usually, these meetings include polite requests for news about current events, short talks about local history, and offers to trade handmade goods for modern supplies or books. Margaret Thornfield, the former postmistress who knew Cordelia Hargreeve, gave one of the most detailed accounts of such an encounter. She said she met a woman she was sure was Cordelia at the Montpelier Farmers Market in 1968, when she was 89 years old. Thornfield said that Cordelia looked almost the same as she did 17 years ago when they last met. They talked pleasantly about local events and people they both knew, as if no time had passed. Thornfield said that the conversation was mostly about intellectual and cultural issues. Cordelia was especially interested in new books that had come out recently, changes in higher education, and social changes that had happened in the area. She also asked about certain families in Melier, asking about people who had died or moved away in the 1950s and being surprised to find out they weren't there. Most memorable, Cordelia invited Thornfield to come to our home in the woods to see her. Tea and talking about schoolwork. When Thornfield said she had heard the house had been torn down, Cordelia smiled and said that the people in their shared intellectual life are what make a community important, not the buildings that hold them temporarily. She told Thornfield that if she wanted to go, she would have no trouble finding the place and that she would enjoy meeting the other members of their academic community. Thornfield never agreed to the invitation, but she did say she was curious about what the visit might show. She said that Cordelia seemed completely normal during their talk, with no signs of mental illness or the effects of whatever she had been through while she was away from mainstream society. The Hargreeve case is still officially unsolved, but law enforcement is no longer looking into it. The Vermont State Archives now has the files, which take up almost 4 cubic feet and include dozens of witnesses, surveys, reports from different researchers, and hundreds of pages of documents from 1951 to 1967 make up the evidence. It may never be possible to find out for sure what happened to Cordelia Hargreeve on the night of November 13, 1951, through regular investigation. The evidence points to a number of options: that she chose to join a community that already existed below her property, that she found a social alternative that was smarter and more personal satisfaction than the lonely life she was living on the surface, or that she met people who had built a successful secret society that had lasted for generations. There have been ongoing reports of people meeting Cordelia and others who fit the descriptions of historical figures connected to the property. This is perhaps the most interesting thing about the Hargreeve house. It suggests that whatever happened there in 1951 was not an ending, but a change. It looks like there is a community living in the cave system under Putney State Forest. Exists alongside mainstream society, sometimes interacting with the outside world, but mostly keeping its own social and intellectual institutions. Dr. Blackwood said in her last report that the truth goes against what most people think about the possibilities for different types of social organization. The Hargreeve case indicates that beneath our known reality, alternative forms of human community persist and evolve according to their own principles, upholding traditions and values that society has often left behind or forgotten. The story of Cordelia Hargreeve is a reminder that Vermont's colonial landscape may still have communities that haven't fully adapted to the modern world. This is especially true for people who walk through Putney State Forest today, when its quiet and natural sounds carry farther and ordinary assumptions seem less certain. The ground we walk on may hide societies where time moves in different ways and where learning and sharing ideas are important. Remain important values, and they are places where people who want to live differently can find acceptance and meaning. And maybe for those who pay close attention to the sounds of the forest, or are open to meeting people who don't fit in with what most people expect, there is still an invitation. The same invitation was sent to Purcell Ashford in 1958, Dr. Blackwood's research team in 1967, and Margaret Thornfield at the farmers' market. An invitation to a community of thinkers, to meaningful conversation, too. Find out what other options are available besides the few that most people in society offer. We still have the choice to look into these options, as we always have. Some communities, once discovered, may offer benefits that make returning to mainstream society less appealing than ongoing engagement in alternatives that most individuals remain unaware of. Test.